Hi, I'm Supernova. I'm going to continue on in How Do We Know the Bible is True, Volume 1 by several authors, but edited by Ken Ham and Bodie Hodge. And I'm going to go into Chapter 2 today. Is the Old Testament reliable? The last video I did was on how do we know that the Bible is true, speaking about how the entire Bible is believed to be true. And this one focuses on just the Old Testament. And before I delve into this, I'd like to point out how even though all of the authors in this book seem to think that the Bible is internally consistent and doesn't contain any contradictions, I don't think they'd know a contradiction if they spotted one. I don't think they know what inconsistency looks like. The reason I point this out is because among the duties that the general editors Ken Ham and Bodie Hodge have, I would think one of them is making this book consistent so that there aren't any arguments inside it that counter other arguments. And they failed to do that. I couldn't help but notice that the author of this chapter has made many of the arguments that were pointed out as logically fallacious by the author of the last chapter, and I will reiterate those as I come across them. This chapter was written by a guy named Brian Edwards. I've never heard of him. Apparently he's a pastor who has written several books according to the bibliography in the back of this book. So let's begin. Why read the Bible? This doesn't really have anything to do with why it's true, but we know why Christians read the Bible. It's because it's the document of their religion and has all their religious rules. Obviously, if you're a Christian, there's good reason to read the Bible. For non-Christians, entertainment, I suppose. He says that millions of Christians listen to thousands of sermons from the Bible, perhaps implying a bandwagon fallacy. Millions of people believe it, so you should too. And they say that Christians believe the Bible to be both reliable and relevant, which is another way of saying they believe it, so you should too. This is skirting the argument from faith that in the last chapter Jason Leisel said was a bad argument. Just because people believe it doesn't make it true. He doesn't quite explicitly say that's what he's trying to argue, but I think that's what's implied here. And if he's not, he's just adding something that doesn't matter, has nothing to do with whether the Old Testament is reliable or the entire Bible itself. The next section is called What the Bible Writers Believed. Now, again, this is something that Jason Leisel in the last chapter pointed out as fallacious. It's begging the question. It doesn't matter if the Bible says that it's true, because you'd have to establish that the Bible is true in order to believe that the writers were true when they said that. But he's going to go ahead and do it anyway and point out all these people who said that the Bible was God-inspired. They use the phrase, thus saith the Lord, over and over. And he kind of conflates the idea of God-inspired and true. Although if the Bible is untrue, then obviously it's God is false and there's no actual inspiration. It wouldn't matter. I don't think he'd care if writers of the Quran said that the Quran is Allah inspired, even though they do believe that. Muhammad, the prophet who came up with a whole bunch of the verses of the Quran, was illiterate. He didn't write any of it himself. So a lot of Muslims believe that it was literally written by their God, Allah. I'm not kidding. They don't think that it was just inspired by him. They think that he was the one who put the words in place. And that's kind of silly. And you can see it's silly. And you don't think that the Quran is true just because its believers think that it was literally written by their God. And it's just as fallacious when he goes through it here. He then goes on to ask, where are all the gods? This has nothing to do with the reliability of the Old Testament. It's just to head off an argument that I imagine he hears from a lot of atheists. He's trying to declare that the Jews didn't steal their religion from all the nations around them, because the Jews believed in monotheism and they all believed in polytheism. And that's not strictly true. We've found from archaeology that the Jews have some polytheistic roots too, but it's really not important. When atheists make these arguments that the Jews were stealing their beliefs from the nations around them, they're making an argument of causation from correlation, and we know that's a logical fallacy. It doesn't matter if other people in other nations had myths that were similar to the Jewish myths. The Jews might have stolen their myths. Those other nations might have stolen their myths from the Jews. It might be a coincidence. They might have drawn their myths from the same source. We don't know. Correlation does not prove causation. It's just not all that relevant anyway. It might be interesting if you were wondering, well, where did these stories come from? We might just wonder if, hey, they might have taken this virgin birth idea from all the other nations that also have these ideas that their gods were born from virgin birth. But it's not necessarily true, and it's really not that important. It could be true even if it just happens to match myths at the time. It's just for interest only. And so I think he digresses into something that isn't relevant for this chapter. But he shouldn't have to make this case. We as atheists shouldn't be trying to draw parallels between the Jewish myths and the other myths. They're just not all that important. It's just curiosity only. Don't bring it up when you're trying to argue why the Bible is not true. It's logically fallacious. His next argument is entitled "Tell It Like It Is." And he makes a very interesting argument where he says, again, he's trying to make the argument that the Jews are unique, as if uniqueness were the same as truth, by saying that the Jews recorded their losses, whereas other nations didn't. And he gives some examples of nations that totally took their losses off the books. And we know this because other countries recorded their wins where they didn't record their losses. Now, this is natural. This is human tendency. People don't want to admit that they're wrong, and a lot of nations don't want to admit that they're fallible. They don't want to admit that their war gods are fallible. And the author of this section is trying to convince us that the Jews were different, but they aren't. I would submit that the Jews didn't record any of God's losses. They just simply recorded military losses and blamed it on the Israelites. You see this common recurring theme throughout the Old Testament, where, for instance, after the Battle of Jericho, I forget, Ai or something they were taking on next, they lose that battle and they say, oh, it's because this guy Achan stole some gold from Jericho. When the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness, it's because of their idolatry and lack of following after God. We see this every time. Every single time the Israelites lose, it's not because Jesus or God failed when he was leading them. It's because they weren't following God right. And if they had been, then they would have certainly won, because God never loses. That's the theme. That's the reason why they're in there. They're morality lessons. Now, there are a couple interesting stories in the Bible that back this up. The first is rather a non-story. In the end of Genesis, the book of Genesis, we see Joseph is the second highest ranking official in Egypt, right under the Pharaoh. And his brothers all seem to be held in high esteem too by the court of Pharaoh. And when we leave Genesis, the Jewish descendants are very high ranking. And then we get to Exodus and we see that all the Jews are slaves. How did they get there? Well, we don't hear about any turning away from God. It's not as if the Jews are worshiping the Egyptian gods or anything. We don't get any of that. They seem to still be following God. So why omit that story of the Israelites losing to Egypt, their downfall, in what we would assume a time of still following after God? because it doesn't fit the theme of people only failing when they turn away from God. That's why it was omitted. It's the exact same kind of omission that he's claiming is found in these other countries that are not like the Israelites at all. And we've got a case at the beginning of Judges that is very interesting for the fact that it is like what Brian Edwards here claims that the Israelites do. They record a loss where we're told that the Israelites won a battle because God was with them, and then the next verse it tells them, but they lost the next one because the enemies had chariots of iron. And we're talking about battles in the Bronze Age, so iron chariots were quite a thing, but one has to wonder, wasn't God still with them? And of course, if you were to run this by a Christian and ask for an explanation, they wouldn't say, oh yeah, well, God lost one. They would try to do the same thing that the Bible does and rationalize it by blaming the Israelites, even though it doesn't specifically in that section say anything about the Israelites doing anything sinful or turning away from God. But that's what the Bible teaches them to do, because that's what the Bible, that's its MO. It keeps doing that over and over. So yeah, the Israelites recorded losses, but there was a good reason for them to. They didn't record losses for God because they believe that their God is infallible in the same way that these other nations believe that their leaders were infallible. The next section is called Tell It Like It Will Be, and this is about the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Now, I'm going to, just like last week, repost the link to Farrell Till's argument on biblical prophecy. He does way better than I possibly could. He deconstructs every possible configuration of prophecy and why they're all false, and he just does it so beautifully, and I would recommend that you read that article. So here he says that there are so many prophecies that have come true, and the article by Farrell Till says why they're not. And he claims that they wouldn't make false prophecies because they would be subjected to death. False prophets were to be put to death. But people can rationalize false prophecies just as Christians do. They'll say, well, it hasn't been fulfilled yet, or yeah, it's been fulfilled, but you don't understand how it's been fulfilled, or they'll give some kind of excuse for it. So how do you prove that somebody's a false prophet? I think people were in on this. They knew that there wasn't very much repercussion for making false prophecies. He specifically speaks of the prophecy of Nahum. I don't know why he picks this example. He says that Nahum is one of the books of the Bible that predicts the fall of Nineveh, and it pretty much only is about the destruction of Nineveh. And he says archaeologists have discovered how accurate his descriptions are, and some of the fire-burnt palace reliefs can be seen in the British Museum of London. The city was so utterly destroyed in 612 BC that 2 centuries after its destruction, the Greek historian Xenophon sat on top of the ruins and had no idea what city it had been. Now, what he claims that skeptics have done to deny this is to claim that the argument most favored by scholars who will not accept Bible prophecy is that the author, under the pseudonym of Nahum, wrote many years beyond the lifetime of any who could have witnessed the fall of Nineveh. That's not true. I really didn't understand. I didn't know any of the history of Nineveh or Nahum, so I looked it up on Wikipedia. And it actually claims that the majority of scholars believe that Nahum wrote this just after the fall of Nineveh. The biblical scholarship, the people who believe in the literal Bible, think that it was written in 615 BC, 3 years before the fall of Nineveh, rather than 612 BC, right after its fall. It doesn't take a stretch of imagination to believe that Nahum simply wrote about it after its fall and claimed that he had written it before its fall. It's just not that weird. And archaeological evidence, any of the evidence that we have now, wouldn't be able to distinguish between it's writing in 612 or 615. So that seems like the most reasonable answer, and I think he's attacking a straw man when he's posing this idea that scholars believe that it was written much, much later. And then he goes on to the prophecies about Christ. I've done a video about why Jesus isn't the Messiah. The prophecies in the Old Testament aren't about him. And he cites two that I've mentioned, Micah 5 and Zechariah 9. I've pointed out that even though those both correlate with what's said about Jesus in the New Testament, if you continue reading those passages, the correlation ends. In Micah 5, too, it talks about him being born in Bethlehem, even though I don't think that's about the city of Bethlehem and rather about the clan of Bethlehem, Ephrathah. It doesn't matter. It continues talking about that character in verse 2. In 5 and 6, it says that he's a war leader who will conquer the Assyrians, which is clearly something that Jesus didn't do. Only 5:2, taken out of context, could fit Jesus, but if you look at the whole context, it obviously doesn't all fit Jesus. And same with Zechariah 9. The verse after the one that mentions that he will ride a colt into the city of Jerusalem says that he will rule from sea to sea. And Jesus was not a ruler. He didn't fulfill that prophecy. It's clearly about the same person. It doesn't change subject or anything. Jesus didn't fulfill that. They only believe that it fulfills this prophecy that's taken out of context. And then he mentions Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. I don't know if I discussed those in the other video, but they're not prophecy. They're non-prophecy. Somebody who is reading those would not think that they were prophesying about something in the future. They're written in flowery language that could be applied to Jesus if you wanted to look at them metaphorically, and many people have, but they're just not prophecy. And I'm just not going to go too much into that. And so obviously these prophecies about Christ are just bunk. Nothing in the Old Testament prophesies Christ. They're talking about an entirely different concept of the Messiah than what the New Testament authors believe. And then he goes on to proof from archaeology, which, again, in the last chapter, was said to not make a decisive case. And this author even starts out by saying archaeology is rubbish, but sometimes it turns up gold. This is pretty much what the author of the last chapter said. His reason for why archaeology didn't prove anything was because archaeology was a bad standard, because it was subject to bias and misinterpretation, and so it shouldn't be trusted. Which is why I wonder why these people keep leaning on it if they think it's a bad standard. But he likes archaeology because it does back up some of the things in the Old Testament. I won't dispute these. Critics once claimed that King David didn't ever exist, and we found out through archaeology that he did, and his kingdom was pretty much just like it was described in the Old Testament, which is great for scholars and Old Testament believers alike. There was an Assyrian king by the name of Sargon, described in Isaiah 21. People think that he didn't exist and then he was discovered. And then critics of the Bible claim King Belteshazzar didn't exist, and then we later found out that he did. And these are nice. These are some cherry-picked examples of successes of Christians in archaeology, and it's good for constructing a inductive argument if they wanted to prove that the Old Testament was reliable by building up a case by saying, well, this was reliable and this was reliable, but it won't ever prove that the Bible is logically true. And of course, it misses the examples where archaeology has proven that the Bible was not true, such as I mentioned the walls of Jericho. We found through archaeology that it couldn't have happened when it was said to have happened. And it appears that it's very likely that the Israelites showed up after the city had fallen and just claimed that they had been the ones to make the victory. He then goes on in this section called The Big Picture to describe how the Bible is following a theme from beginning to end, and he's more or less trying to connect the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is a poor case, but it's very hard to do because the New Testament was clearly tacked on to the Old Testament. It was stealing a religion and changing it slightly and claiming that it was the same one. But, you know, don't hate the Christians so much. They got theirs in the end from the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses that did the exact same thing. They added their own scriptures onto the existing Old New Testament and claimed that they had been precursors to their own religions and that some of the rules were going to change, but that's okay because it's a new covenant. Yeah, they did that to the Jews. He claims that the entirety of the Old Testament is about Jesus and Satan, which is kind of funny because the Old Testament never mentions that God has a son. Not once. The phrase son of God or God's son, none of that, never found in the Old Testament. If you read just the Old Testament, you would never think that God had a son. And he says it starts in Genesis, this entire relationship between Jesus and Satan, by the prophecy that a day would come when the offspring of a woman would crush Satan, Genesis 3:15. Let me set the scene in context. I think this is rather important to talk about. There are a lot of people who believe that in the Garden of Eden story, the tempter was Satan. There's absolutely no evidence for this. The tempter is a snake or a serpent, and they keep referring to him as a snake and never refer to him as anything else. And you may say, well, yeah, but he talked and he did evil things. Of course, he was possessed by Satan. But that still doesn't make any sense. Not only would a Satan not talk if it had a human brain or was possessed, they're just not built for it. They don't have the hardware. They have a cleft palate, no lips, no voice box, tongue and teeth that are totally inappropriate for speech. They couldn't talk even if they could understand the ideas in their head. But nevertheless, this section where it supposedly talks about Jesus crushing Satan is not a prophecy, but a description of the punishments being wrought on the snake because of what it did. If I remember correctly, it said that he was cursed above the cattle and the beasts of the field. And the reason that he's being compared to other animals is because it's punishment on an animal. It doesn't make sense to compare Lucifer to the beasts of the field. The snake is the most cursed of the beasts of the field, according to this. He will crawl on his belly and eat dust, things that clearly aren't true about Satan, but are true about snakes. Granted, snakes don't eat dust, but a Bronze Age biologist who just didn't understand snakes so well might think that they ate dust. The next verse doesn't specifically say that the offspring of the woman will crush Satan. It says, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed, meaning the descendants of the snake. Satan doesn't have any children. The descendants of the snake and the descendants of the woman, meaning all women, not specifically one in the future as is referenced here. And it doesn't just say that they will crush the serpents. It said, you will bite their heel and they will crush your head, which is something that makes sense for a snake that is right down by a person's heel. They will bite heels and they will get their heads crushed by humans that don't like them and want to kill them. None of that makes sense when applied to Satan. I don't understand this idea of why anybody thinks that Satan is the serpent. But anyway, it's clearly not the start of this theme. And then he says, I have no space here to explore this in detail. But good, you wouldn't have a case. The entirety of the Old Testament is not about this relationship between Jesus and Satan. Satan is mentioned in very few verses, Jesus in none of them. It doesn't make sense to even believe that. And then the last section of this chapter says, what the wise men says. say. At least this isn't one of the logical fallacies pointed out in the last chapter, but it is a logical fallacy. It's the argument from authority. It says many able archaeologists and Old Testament scholars, past and present, have accepted the historical accuracy of the Old Testament records, and it has several of them and what they claimed. Doesn't matter. One would assume that they were Christians and that's why they believed it. But even if they weren't, it doesn't matter if they believed it. It's the same bad argument you say millions of Christians believe it. Their authority doesn't make it true. No matter how much you believe it, it doesn't make it true. So anyway, he goes through the whole Old Testament trying to explain why it's reliable, and he fails in making his case. It's rather frustrating because if I was a Christian, I could make a case. I would make an inductive argument that points out all the things that are true, and I wouldn't try to prove that it was 100% accurate, but I would try to prove that it was at least reliable in the general sense of the word, that you could count upon it. And of course, that would invite people to bring in counterexamples and show that it's not reliable by pointing out all the things that aren't true. And Christians just simply can't have this. They can't believe that the Bible is reliable, but not necessarily true. And if they did, they could make a better case. But I mean, you can lead a horse to water. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and tomorrow I'll move on to chapter 3. Is the New Testament reliable? And spoiler alert, it's going to be just as bad as the last 2 chapters. What do you expect? They're all coming from the same point of view. And if you have any comments or questions, leave them below. Feel free to share this, subscribe if you haven't, and peace out. I'll catch you around.